welcome to this week's lecture on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In today's session, I would like to discuss the idea of feminine silence and marginality in relation to this novel. In this session, it would be ideal to talk about feminine silence in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by first talking about Percy Shelley's preface to the 1818 edition of this novel. In this preface, one of the aims of Percy Shelley seems to be to elevate Frankenstein above other novelistic products on offer at the time. So he seems to be arguing that this novel seems to be offering something unique when it is compared to other novels produced at that time. He says, I quote, "I am by no means indifferent to the manner in which whatever moral tendencies exist in the sentiments or characters it contains shall affect the reader. Yet, my chief concern in this respect has been limited to the avoiding the enervating effects of the novels of the present day and to the exhibition of the amiableness of domestic affection and the excellence of universal virtue." So what Percy is arguing for here in the preface to Mary's novel is that this novel is offering the amiableness of domestic affection. It is portraying the wonderful nature of domesticity, and that it is representing the triumph of good over evil. So and that it is kind of projecting the need for universal virtue. So you can see that in this comment, at least, there is no reference to the idea of the Gothic. It is portrayed as a novel which speaks for the idea of universal common goodness against its opposite, the contrary in this work. So and you can also see how he is talking about the enervating effects of the novels which have detrimental effects, negative effects on the readers, which were being produced at the same time as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Further, it is significant to note that Shelley is stating that he is aware of the fact that sentiments and tendencies and the nature of characters in the novel will have an impact on the psyche of the reader. So if you go back to that phrase, whatever moral tendencies exist in the sentiments or characters shall affect the reader. So the novel is a powerful object because it has an effect on the reader, and that Frankenstein is going to be different from the rest of the novels of the time because of its capacity to offer the ideal set of circumstances which can be used as a model for the readers. So when you talk about the enervating effects, the idea mentioned in the preface by Percy Shelley, and the critic Angela Wright mentions that the allusion to the enervating effects of the novels of the present day is an evocation of William Wordsworth's earlier implicit denigration of the Gothic in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, where he complained of the frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse that he perceived to be contaminating literary taste in Britain. So you can see, with this context in mind, the context of William Wordsworth's attack on the Gothic in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is supposed to have ushered the romantic movement in Great Britain, that Percy is reacting to the attack of William Wordsworth when he is writing the preface to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So he is trying to differentiate between Mary's work and the frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and extravagant stories. So what he's trying to do is to kind of marginalize the idea of the Gothic when he is categorizing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Instead, what he projects the novel to be is a kind of a statement of ideal domesticity, and as showcasing the triumph of good over evil. So you can see the web of literary taste and movements and criticism that is going on as a backdrop to that preface. Further, it is to be noted that the 1818 preface takes considerable care to distance itself from the Gothic form, only admitting its inspiration from the collection of German ghost stories, Phantasmagoriana, in the famous ghost story competition of the Villa Diodati, in the most coyly apologetic terms, with the comment that these tales excited in us a playful desire of imitation. So when Hussey is writing this preface to Mary's Frankenstein, he realizes that the label of the Gothic might have detrimental effect in terms of the kind of criticism it might provoke from the sophisticated circles to which poets such as William Wordsworth belong to. So he just kind of refers to the idea of the Gothic in relation to the ghost stories from which this novel was inspired during that ghost story competition that we discussed at length in the previous lecture at Villa Diodati, the place where Mary Shelley started writing, got the inspiration to write Frankenstein. So he just mentions that the inspiration came from the German Gothic stories, and it was a kind of a playful, a kind of a game. It's a playful desire of imitation. It is not to be taken too seriously. It was inspired by these tales, but the end product is something else. So he is kind of trying to distance Frankenstein from the Gothic tradition, because he thinks that that is not going to be appreciated by highbrow commentators, and that Gothic has its own kind of set of responses from the higher critics, which the negativity from those critics he doesn't want to be applied in relation to the assessment of Frankenstein. The preface further concludes by moving away from this carefully encoded reference to the ghost story competition. So the competition, the contest, and the context for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is kind of recurrent. That seems to be a key moment for this origin narrative of Frankenstein, which keeps recurring when we are talking about the nature of this novel. So he refers to that originary moment for the birth of this novel. I quote, "The weather, however, suddenly became serene, and my two friends left me on a journey among the Alps, and lost in the magnificent scenes which they present all memory of their ghostly visions." So nature in this preface trumps the light amusement of fictional creation, exorcising the ghostly visions that made that the male friends in the group only entertained when they were in need of indoors diversion. So if you look at the way this has been set up, in the words of Shelley, he seems to be stating that, when the weather became better, we all broke up, my friends left for a trip among the Alps, and the ghostly visions also disappeared, with the weather becoming more conducive for outdoor exploration. So Gothic and the idea of supernatural narrative seem to be associated with the indoors diversion when the weather is extremely hostile. So it's a momentary thing. That's what Percy Shelley seems to be mentioning, and it just seems to be a kind of a dream which vanished when day broke. So that kind of idea is deliberately inserted in the preface in order to kind of marginalize that very serious, macabre, ghostly ambience of the nights, during which all the friends sat together and talked about supernatural narratives. So that is marginalized here. I want to connect that idea with Robert Walton, the Arctic explorer who rescues Victor Frankenstein when he is, lost among the Arctic wastes in his pursuit of the monster. So Walton is a character who kind of admires the sublimity of nature, and his wonder and appreciation of the beauty of the Arctic is apparent in his description of the scenery that he witnesses. He presents it as a strange place, which Frankenstein later tells him makes it appropriate for the strange tale he will hear. Its unfamiliarity and wild beauty heighten Walton's desire to explore it. Like Frankenstein, Walton celebrates the majesty and the power of nature in his description of it. So, Walton's appreciation of nature is crucial. It is crucial because it brings in the idea of sublime nature, nature which is beautiful and at the same time awe-inspiring, striking a kind of strange fear in the person who is witnessing it. And secondly, Frankenstein relates to Walton's admiration and appreciation of nature, the sublimity of nature, and says that this setting is perfect for him, for Victor, to relate the story, the strange and bizarre story of how he created the monster, which is kind of wreaking vengeance on him and his family. So the unfamiliarity and the wild beauty is related to the strange tale of Frankenstein, and that relationship is crucial to the idea of the Gothic and its discussions for this novel. And it also kind of takes us back to that discussions of the friends in Villa Diodati and their setting in inclement weather. So that pattern keeps recurring. The reality and the fiction is kind of overlapping in the narrativization of Frankenstein's story. Now, the female is largely silent in the story of Frankenstein, and the silence of the female author of Frankenstein in the 1818 preface is echoed uncannily in the very framework of the tale. So Mary Shelley is not writing a preface, it's her husband Percy who's writing a preface in 1818, and the novel itself begins as a series of 4 letters addressed from the explorer Robert Walton to the silent addressee Mrs. Saville, Mrs. Margaret Saville. MS is the initials used in the novel as well. So both the female author is silent, and there are no major female characters in the novel as well. Of course, there are characters, but they don't play any great part in the way events unfold. Elspeth Levenza dies, Justine dies. So you can see that large share of the actions are performed or in relation to the male characters. We learn in the second sentence of the novel and from the first letter that Mrs. Saville is Walton's dear sister, but only after Walton has mentioned it in his opening sentence that this addressee has regarded his enterprise with such evil foreboding. So not only is the female silent, the female is also not very appreciative, or the female does not have very high regard for the enterprise on which Robert Walton is embarked on. She looks at it with evil forebodings, as with anticipation of things bad for this project. So you can see a particular kind of characterization evolving from the silence to the way the female judges the male adventure project. So Walton, in his letters, is trying to convince her to feel and think in a more positive way. And I quote, this is from the novel: "You cannot contest the inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation," Walton pleads at one point. Further on in letter 1, he tries to convince himself of the merit of his enterprise. "And now, dear Margaret, do I not deserve to accomplish some great purpose?" But there is no answer. There is no return letter from Mrs. Saville, and she remains silent throughout Frankenstein. So, while the silence of the female is important, there is also an important characteristic of Walton which emerges from these letters, which is that he desires to confer benefit on mankind. He is trying to act as the benefactor, as someone who is going to offer mankind innumerable benefits by his actions, by his explorations. And in that regard, he can be compared to Victor Frankenstein, who creates this new race by first creating the monster, and but we know that even that first creation becomes an utter failure, and how Victor also destroys the second female monster that he creates. So you can see the similarity between the two, and how both are related as well to the idea of the Promethean legend, which I'll come to shortly in this lecture. While we understand that the feminine has been suppressed and made silent, and that there is a marginalization of the feminine in Frankenstein, we also realize that it never vanishes from the narrative altogether. It is kind of, having an impact on the male hero's adventures. The novel's narrative structure exposes the men's agency and the ambitious aspirations, at least potentially, to the judgment of the female gaze, which belongs both to the fictional reader Margaret Saville and the writer Mary Shelley. So this is an important argument which suggests that while the feminine is silent, the feminine is the judge. She is judging constantly the adventures of the male. Robert Walton is desperate to kind of seek the approval of his sister Margaret Saville, and Margaret Saville can be a stand-in for Mary Shelley herself. So MS, you can see how the initials kind of could suggest either Saville or it can be a stand-in for the writer herself. So the female gaze seems to be the ultimately significant gaze, and it is to that gaze all these narratives are offered, and it is also a common assumption that many of the Gothic fiction were read by women rather than by the men. So you can see how ultimately the novel comes to the eyes of the female reader. So even though there is a marginalization of the feminine, the feminine is the kind of an all-seeing eyes which are kind of judging the actions of the men. Walton's expositional letters demonstrate that he is not fixed in his purpose. He reminds Margaret of his earlier ambitions to create poetry and how they have now transformed into greater quest for glory in the seafaring life that his father explicitly denied him upon his deathbed. So the letters are also offering a glimpse into the kind of character that Walton is, who initially wanted to become, great by writing poetry, but then upon the denial of his father, he embarks on his seafaring quest. So that kind of uncertainty as to the choice of his profession also kind of tells you the kind of man that Walton is, who doesn't seem to be fixed in his ambition. Critic Anne K. Mellor has observed that, like Victor Frankenstein himself, Walton is thus another Promethean poet seeking to create a more perfect humanity by revealing a new land of fire and light to man. Walton provides a shadowy double of Victor Frankenstein in his Promethean quest, ambition, and inattention to the safety of those around him. So this is a kind of a scathing criticism on Victor Frankenstein as well as on Robert Walton, who seem to kind of disregard the safety of those around him by embarking on dangerous escapades or adventures. So Walton can also be a Promethean figure, just as Victor Frankenstein is. Because Walton wants to kind of show the rest of the humanity the Northwestern Passage, just as Victor Frankenstein wants to kind of create a new race of creatures by his remarkable and resourceful knowledge. So this kind of offering a new path or a new land of fire and light to mankind is dangerous, and that is what Frankenstein reveals to the readers and to the men who are involved in such great enterprises. Now let's quickly see what Prometheus legend is about in relation to Aeschylus, who wrote this play Prometheus Bound, and Prometheus is the titan who brings the fire and civilization to mortals. So he is the bringer of light and civilization, and he's also their preserver, and gives them all the arts and sciences as a means of their survival. But then he is punished for his overreaching capacity. He kind of overreaches, he oversteps the bounds of what he's supposed to, and Zeus punishes him by tying him to a rock and having an eagle eat on his liver, which seems to regenerate. So it's a constant punishment. And if you compare this with the novel, Victor Frankenstein is kind of constantly punished, repetitively punished, by having his brother die at the hands of the monster, then his best friend Henry, and then his own wife Elspeth. So it's a series of punishments which kind of repeatedly attacks Victor's peace of mind and well-being, and Victor himself loses his life because of this constant terror and dread and physical suffering that he undergoes because of this creature. Now, I want to kind of touch upon the idea of the monster and marginality from a different point of view, and we need to realize that the creature, which is forced right from its inception into a posture of marginality, if you remember the moment of the creature coming to life, it kind of is like a child, an infant, and it kind of reaches out to Victor, and Victor flees. This creature, bit by bit, is forced to discover itself as a monster. It doesn't realize that it is a thing of dread, that it's a horrid contrast to the rest of humanity. It's kind of being for itself determined. Its being is determined by the gaze of others. The others judge the kind of nature that the monster is supposed to possess, and so begin some of the most painful of romantic educations, one that only a woman, a slave, or a colonized subject could imagine. So the monster can be a symbol for all these different categories, the female, the slave, and the colonized subject, because all these categories are also marginalized, oppressed, and rejected by the powerful other. So it's a fantastic kind of set of interpretations that one can see through the figure of the monster. Thank you for watching. I'll continue the next session.